So, ladies and gentlemen, it is a Wednesday night in Philadelphia, and the world is as complicated as ever. So, let's talk about it. Welcome to the October 2018 edition of Geopolitics with Granary, FPRI's monthly discussion of international affairs. I'm Ron Granary, executive director, of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West, and your host and moderator of tonight's discussion. All of us at FPRI thank you for joining us today, live and archived on the internet, and live this evening on October 10th, 2018, at the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia. It's a pleasure to have you with us. I want to start tonight with a quotation. The inability of the United States and Pakistan to influence each other stemmed from their differences in perceptions of the threat facing the two countries. Except for brief periods and on limited issues, in order for the presently revived relationship to show demonstrably better results, Washington and Islamabad would need to arrive at some consensus on the threat and attain some commonality of goals. Those words, written by a brilliant young scholar in 1982, could have been written last week. As the United States marks, though by no means celebrates, the 17th year of fighting in neighboring Afghanistan, US-Pakistani relations remain puzzling, frustrating, and essential to long-term regional peace and stability, and to the eventual end of America's longest war. It would be interesting to ask that brilliant young scholar's opinion about the current state of affairs in Pakistan and in South Asia, as well as about current interests, ideas, and individuals shaping United States foreign policy. Well, we're in luck, because our guest tonight is that brilliant young scholar who wrote that book when she was at the beginning of an academic and diplomatic career that took her from Hyderabad to Peshawar to Delaware, Ohio, then to Philadelphia, Washington, and the United Nations. A child of the Indian subcontinent in all its glorious diversity, Ambassador Shirin Tahir-Kheli, a Muslim from India, grew up on Pakistan's northwest frontier and became not only an American citizen, but valued advisor to presidents and a representative of her adopted country at the highest levels. Dr. Tahir-Kheli has just published a memoir of her life and career, Before the Age of Prejudice, a Muslim woman's national security work with 3 American presidents, where she details her literal and figurative journey that led her to many firsts, most significantly perhaps the first Muslim, man or woman, to be nominated to a U.S. ambassadorship. She experienced some of the most dramatic moments of those decades, from triangular diplomacy between the U.S., India, and Pakistan during the Soviet war in Afghanistan, to both Gulf Wars, 9/11, and the continuing efforts to rally the United Nations behind the causes of human rights and women's empowerment. She worked with every bold-faced name in American foreign policy. Some of them come off better than others in the book. Through it all, in a memoir dedicated to the American dream, Ambassador Tahir-Kheli both models and pleads for the, quote, assimilation, understanding, and appreciation for the freedom of religions that is unique to the American perspective, the American experience, and which is the future of our children and grandchildren as we nurture in them the same sense of belonging to this great country we call home. So what does such a career tell us about the role of immigrants in American society? How has U.S. foreign policy toward India and Pakistan and the Muslim world changed over the decades? What does the current era tell us about the success and failures of the past and the possibilities of the future? These questions, and yours, will guide us tonight in discussion with our guest, Ambassador Shirin Tahir-Kheli. Ambassador Shirin Tahir-Kheli is an adjunct scholar of the Foreign Policy Research Institute and serves on its board of advisors. She was, once upon a time, a fellow scholar intern at the Foreign Policy Research Institute who was literally selected by the founder of FPRI, Dr. Robert Strauss Hupé, who saw in her, when she and her husband visited the University of Pennsylvania in 1962, thank you, saw the potential that the rest of the world eventually saw as well. She is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, rising to senior positions at the National Security Council, such as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director in the Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush administrations, and as a U.S. ambassador to the UN. Ambassador Tahir-Kheli, who studied at Ohio Wesleyan and has both an MA and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, was named by Newsweek in 2011 as one of the 150 women who shake the world for her diplomatic work, and she is the author and editor of several monographs in addition to her memoir, including India, Pakistan, and the United States, published by the Council of Foreign Relations in 1997, and The United States and Pakistan, The Evolution of an Influence Relationship, from which I quoted at the beginning of this introduction. A brilliant and experienced scholar, diplomat, and public servant, and one of the most accomplished alumnae of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, we are delighted to have her with us tonight. Welcome, Ambassador Shirin Tahir-Kheli.
Thank you.
So Shirin, I want to start with a basic biographical question, right? How do you get from Hyderabad to the Foreign Policy Research Institute?
Well, before I start that journey, I do want to say thank you, Ron. I'm looking forward to this with you. You've done your homework, and I think I'm going to be grilled, and that's good. I also want to thank my friend and president of the Institute, Alan Luxembourg. I have been extremely fortunate in having known the founding president of the FPRI as well as every subsequent one. And as somebody asked me at last year's annual dinner, so how old are you? So I'm very, very old, but nonetheless, it's a pleasure to be here in this milieu, which is home. I mean, I am an FPRI creation, you know, in many, many ways. I was a junior fellow. It was my first job. And you know, that's another first that stays with me.
Indeed.
And being a junior fellow working directly for Strauss Hupé was no slouching time. You know, I was learning on the run and then I became a senior fellow later and have done the work that I did in India-Pakistan peace in conjunction with FPRI. The Balusa was housed at FPRI. So my association with FPRI is a proud one, and it's a deep one. And I'm always grateful every interaction I've had with all of the wonderful people I've gotten to know. And this chance is very much a part of my scene. The journey. You know, I did not want to do a memoir because I never thought my life was very interesting. But people kept hounding me that, no, you got to do it. And it was actually Condi Rice in the middle of a meeting in the Oval Office. We were waiting for some head of state to come. And Condi and I was talking to the president about some issue that had to be resolved at that meeting. And all of a sudden, she turns to me and says, you know, you got to write a memoir. And so that becomes the topic of conversation, and they announce that the guest has arrived. So afterwards, she sort of reminded me many, many times that I needed to do this, because and that's what got me sort of thinking about it. She said, you know, it's a rare story, but it is an American story. And that is what made me very sort of focused on it, because I do believe that it is that, because it is only in America story. So could this have happened? And in that sense, I am very, very glad that I went down this route with all of the help that various people and encouragement that they gave. Being in Hyderabad was obviously an accident of history. In the time that I was born, Hyderabad was still, it was known to be the world's richest state. It had gold mines, diamonds, emeralds. That's a pretty good combination of things. Small state, had a coastline. I mean, Hyderabad was an extremely prosperous state with a small population, a Muslim ruler, Nizam, and a majority Hindu population. My grandfather, my mother's father, was the last prime minister of Hyderabad before 1947 and all of that. So it was an Indian nobility, royalty did not do kind of, you know, stripped down opulence. I mean, it was pretty elaborate, it was pretty ceremonial, it was exquisite. So one grew up in that kind of an environment, which was kind of a, for a short time, because, you know, it was obviously a very comfortable equation. But that wasn't all it was, because I was, after all, not only my grandfather's granddaughter, but I was my father's daughter. My father, who'd been educated in both the traditions of the East, he had, and then had gone on to do a tripos at Cambridge in England, had gone on to do an MA in Paris, and his DPhil, his PhD, in Germany. He's a mathematician, physicist. He had worked with Einstein and Heisenberg. He'd come back to India to do mathematics, where mathematics is still quite a thing in India. Had been nominated for a Nobel Prize in mathematics. So, you know, and he was the sort of the quintessential combination of East and West. He totally believed that daughters as well as sons should be educated, that education was the primary thing in life, that the rest came and went, that if you had your moorings right, you could survive anywhere. So that lesson, and it came with a, you know, my parents' friends, part of course, the elaborate Muslim culture of Hyderabad. But there were no divisions. I mean, my parents' friends were Hindus, Parsis, any number of other things. We were friends with everybody. So there wasn't, you know, the idea was you knew who you were, but you tried to be receptive, respectful, and you reached out to people. So that was the upbringing that actually, and I'm very, very grateful that for that part of it, not just, you know, growing up in a palace part of it. But then came Pakistan. Out of the blue, my father used to go every year to Lahore because he was also a scholar of Persian. And every year in Lahore, there was a conference that celebrated poetry, Persian, mostly done in those days. The traditions was mostly in Persian. And also, there was an annual mathematics conference. So they combined the two, and he would go every year. Well, he went in 1948, and the founders of Pakistan said, you have to stay here and help us develop education in this new country. And my father, being my father, said, okay. So that was, you know, and sent a telegram saying, staying in Pakistan to my mother, which at that time, because there was, well, I don't know, the hostility is different, it still continues. But there was a lot of anger about people who didn't need to go, who moved. So when the government of India got hold of that telegram, they came and they shut down bank accounts. They in fact took away the house. We lived in there with rent and so on. So my father and then we eventually joined my father in Pakistan. And the Pakistan that I grew up in was the one where, you know, I mean, Liaquat Ali Khan was prime minister. People never talked about what they were giving up. They talked about what they were trying to do, what they were trying to establish. And my parents, who actually gave up a lot to move to Peshawar, never ever looked back. I mean, it was all about, can they make this new thing work? My father went on to establish 3 of the 5 major universities in Pakistan from a piece of land and a dream, and started the first engagement with the US in an exchange program. So, I mean, it was an extraordinary living in that sense. So that's what got us from Hyderabad to Peshawar.
Interesting thing, right? I think of the combination of a mathematician and a poet, right? It would take a mathematician and a poet to want to create a state in the modern world. And so your experience growing up in Pakistan in the 1950s and in the 1960s, right? This is literally a state that's being stood up.
Right.
When you look at Pakistan today, Do you see the fulfillment of the vision of your father's generation?
You know, it's a complicated question. I know there are a lot of people from Pakistan, some of whom we all know, who sort of think it's just everything's failed and worth giving up. But I tend to look at it differently. I think the idea of Pakistan was one that came about, and I have never met, despite the problems Pakistan has had, and even people like myself who, you know, have family in India, go back and forth. Nehru tried to coax my father back, saying, "You left, but now you're back for a conference in Delhi. I'm going to ask you to stay." So, you know, we never had a kind of a breaking of bonds. But I have never met anybody in Pakistan who has said, "I wish we hadn't left."
That's exactly what I was wondering to ask you.
Because you look at what's happening today to India's 150 million Muslim minority, majority actually. I mean, it's a large chunk of 1 billion people. You don't, and I've had this running, I mean, we're jumping decades now in this conversation. But as I've gone back and forth, both in my official work to India and as a friend of India, as a original citizen of India, and both in my government work and in my non-government work. I've known all of the leaders in India as well, and when I've gone to see the foreign minister in the Ministry of External Affairs or the defense minister in the Ministry of Defense, and starting in about 1980s, I started to keep track of the names of it, because obviously you're meeting the ministry or in the senior corridors. You're not going to be checking who's down in the bowels of the building. And in all those years, I only saw 2 Muslim names in the national security places in India.
This is in the 3rd largest Muslim country
yes,
in the world. Right?
Yes, and Muslims cannot get into the Indian Institutes of Technology. They're not members of the armed forces. They cannot get into the civil service. So, you know, they're great Bollywood dancers, actors, and singers, but so I've always said to my, you know, Indian relatives and friends that I'll believe it when one of them becomes a general in the army or whatever. I mean, 150 million people cannot be suspect. It's kind of, they have nowhere to go in Pakistan. They are Indians. So I think people look at this and say, and as India turns more Hindutva and more right-wing and more nationalist, I think this is accelerating this trend. So people say, well, okay, things are not good. They should have been better. But at least we are home. Well, sense of belonging is important.
This question of the sense of belonging, I want to take that as your journey moves along, right? As you move from Pakistan to the United States, you and your husband, and you start your family. What was the feeling when you first came to the United States, right? Who did people think you were, and who did you think you were when you were beginning here in the U.S.?
My husband and I ended up in the United States in large part because I'd already been to the United States to go to college. So, because he did his PhD at Oxford, and, you know, he was very British. And I had a terrible accent from Delaware, Ohio. And, you know, and it was...
I should ask, what's it like to go from Peshawar to Delaware, Ohio, right?
And it was the most phenomenal journey. That was probably the most phenomenal of the journeys. Because, you know, I was 8 years old in Peshawar, and my father had started this first ever exchange program between the University of Peshawar and Colorado State University. Because he said, because we're given a scientific sort of links, etc., he said they will help us build things. And in the Pakistan and Peshawar of those days, American professors came and stayed 2 years on campus. And they came with their children. There was an American school, the kids went. And I got to know some of these young people because I was home I went to a boarding school in Murray in Pakistan, so I would be coming home for our vacations because it was at 7,000 feet and 6 feet of snow any given moment between December and March. So when I would come home, these kids would be at the university. So I got to know them, and one day, while I was home on vacation, one of my good friends, the American girl, said to me, you know, we are going to do an American night at the Rotary Club. We had a Rotary Club in Peshawar, I want you to know. So I said, okay, what's an American night? So she said, well, we're going to sing songs about America, and America the Beautiful, God Bless America, and she went through the horse. And she said, one of the singers has laryngitis, so if we teach you the songs, would you like to sing? So I thought, oh, this is a great, you know, I'm always for new experiences. I said, sure. So anyway, she taught me the songs, and we practiced and practiced, and we had this American night. And it was fantastic. And it's thinking about, you know, sort of amber waves of grain and purple mountain majesty. I thought, whoa, this is incredible. So as we were driving, and my father was the vice chancellor building Peshawar University, and he was one of the leading sort of social people in the town. So he and my mother were also in the audience. And as we were driving home, and those days, home was, you know, back in no man's land, and the performance was in the cantonment, which is on this side. So it had to sort of end before we got really late. And on the car going back, I said to my mother, you know, I'm not going to go to Cambridge, which is where my family went in England, to be educated. And she said, why, you don't want to get educated? I said, no, I'm going to America. And they sort of said, okay, you know, didn't do much. So I thought, hey, this is easy, you know. But I was 8 years old, and then 9 years old, so I thought, okay. So came time, I'd finished school early. I had finished school, and I was 13 years old. So I had to go to university. And my parents said, well, 13's a little young, but maybe we wait another year. So I did some other stuff. And then came time to really go to university, because in their eyes, I was getting to be an old lady and still not doing it. Yes. So then I said, but remember, I was going to go to America. And my parents said, you were serious? I said, yeah, I'm not going to England, because my father was going to take me to England for an interview. So my parents then, my father was in the National Cabinet as the advisor on education for Ayub Khan. So he took some time off, and he came to Columbia University supposedly for 3 months, but couldn't stay because of his work 3 months. But when we came to Columbia, everybody said, you can't leave a 14-year-old from Peshawar in Manhattan. That's just a bridge too far. So, and I was, of course, mesmerized, because I thought, you know, I mean, and in my book I write about just landing at Kennedy Airport. But the thing that first hit me was, you know, we kept going. We stopped in London for 2 days, and we were still flying. There was an emergency on this TWA turbojet, you know, we landed in Gander, and you know, we finally got to, and I kept saying to her, Mother, you know, America is so far. And she said, didn't you look at a map? And I said, no. I had no idea it was that far from Pakistan. This is pre-cell phones, pre-FaceTime, pre-anything. But the mail worked in those days, thank goodness. So then a friend of my parents who'd been in Peshawar for that exchange program was a professor at Colorado State. And she sort of advised them that I needed to go to a small liberal arts school. And they came up with Delaware, Ohio Wesleyan. And so my father then took me to Delaware, Ohio, and we flew to Columbus, and my first ever bus ride was from Columbus to Delaware. And I was so excited to get on a Greyhound bus, because I'd never been on a bus, you know, before. And I thought, and we got there, and my father, because he was president of the university, and many universities in Pakistan, the Ohio Wesleyan sort of did him the courtesy of having him wait with the president. And I had to go through a series of, I mean, a whole day of interviews, because, you know, I was not quite 15, and they didn't know what the heck to do with me. And so I had enthusiasm, but that didn't necessarily translate to anything tangible. And that was sort of, but then I remember thinking, I'm never going to make it. They'll send me into high school. And I was terrified from all the Hollywood movies with high school. So I told my father, if I don't get into college, I go back with you today and go back to Pakistan. And, and we were sitting there, and after the interviews, we were waiting, and the 3 faculty committee came and pulled my father aside, and I thought, well, it was a good trip, you know, it was nice. And then they my father looked very perplexed, and he didn't quite get the American system. And then the president sort of intervened, and because he said, you know, we'll take her, but we won't take her as a freshman, we'll take her as a junior. So I thought, junior, that must mean I go into middle school, you know. So those were and I'm sorry about that, because I would have loved to have spent 4 years of college here.
So instead you spent 2 years at Ohio Wesleyan, then you got married. I want to jump ahead because I'm curious about this, right? To think about that experience when you first came to the United States. And how does that compare to your first experience when you were called to come work at the National Security Council, which would have been in 1982?
Well, the first call came when this book came out to go to the policy planning staff to work for.
Policy planning staff, right? That's right.
Paul Wolfowitz.
Paul Wolfowitz. One of those bold-faced names I mentioned at the beginning.
Yes. And you know, going to Delaware, Ohio, which I mean, I love the Midwest. People say, "Where are you from?" I sometimes say Ohio, and that really confuses people, because it was the first place I really felt, you know, made home. People were fantastic, and I was, you know, there were only 2 foreign students in the entire town and university. One was a German girl, and I was the only foreign-looking foreign student. So, you know, I was a curiosity. Sure. People would ask funny questions like, do you guys live in trees? I mean, this sort of thing. But they were extraordinarily kind. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was just one of those 2 years of great thing. But what it did teach me is that if you have your bearings right, it's okay to go to new situations. Mm-hmm. So when I had actually got called to talk, Frank Fukuyama said, your book is out, we have a vizier visit coming up, these are the 2 issues, the policy planning director would like to talk to you. So I said, sure, you know, and I was teaching at Temple, I was on the faculty. Mm-hmm. So I went down for the day, and there were 1 or 2 other people there, and they had questions and comments, and I disagreed with everybody, because I thought this was a moment in history for the US-Pakistan relationship that could be unique. Mm-hmm. So it shouldn't be taken in the, you know, what we did in 55, 65, you know, and it needed to be, there was a possibility of something different. So when I left and came, you know, the place, I thought, well, this is going to be a very short one-time event, because obviously, I mean, nobody agreed with me and so on. And that night, Paul called and said, would you come and work for us? And I'd just been tenured. Mm-hmm. So I thought, why would I give up my tenure in Philadelphia? And my husband and I are both at the same place, and I have 2 kids, go to Washington. But then I sort of thought, well, it's an extraordinary chance. I mean, here I'm writing about foreign policy. Here's a chance to get involved in the making of foreign policy. Mm-hmm. So it made one excited about opportunities without being overwhelmed. I think that was the gift my parents gave all of their kids.
Interesting. Yeah. And yet, I am curious, because I'm trying to imagine policy planning staff at the State Department circa 1982, 1983. And I don't imagine that the State Department was much more diverse than Ohio Wesleyan University was.
Not at that time.
And so once again, right, you walk into a place,
yeah.
and so I'm curious,
yeah.
right, when you go places, right, I mean, you have this adventurous spirit, I'm ready to explain these experiences. When people meet you, what do you think shocks them more? That you're a woman in the foreign policy world, that you're a Muslim woman from the foreign policy world, that you're a Muslim woman from South Asia in the foreign policy world? Probably
all of the above. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I was really being sort of taught, you know, security, national security, strategic affairs, those issues, and got to be a practitioner, there were very few women, I mean, a handful of women in the business.
Sure.
Across American women. There were more abroad, actually, strangely, mm-hmm. but not here. So whenever one went somewhere, and I mean, Condi Rice recites her
sure.
Sort of experiences, people first look at you and think, I mean, I write about one of the funny stories in my life, because I went to, on a 1-year fellowship to teach at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. A very, very important learning time for me, because I got to work with one of the really incredible minds, Colonel Stoudemire, who worked with the Pentagon J5 to I mean, the CENTCOM was being set up. I got to work as the regional expert to help in its setting up. So, you know, when we fly to the Pentagon, I mean, applying for that security clearance, I mean, the people said, she'll never get cleared. I mean, where did you live until you were 18? I mean, all over the place. So that took a while, but anyway, I got there, and you arrive and you're a professor at this Army War College, and I think I was the only female who wasn't a secretary. So every time I went somewhere, they'd say, honey, who's your boss? So I said, I don't know, Colonel Merritt, General Merritt, I guess. And they said, oh, you're his secretary? I said, no. And, you know, it never occurred to me they were actually wondering what I did. I write about the funny thing that happened because we used to go for these very highfalutin briefings in their auditorium, and a general from the Pentagon had come, you know, very senior general, should or may not named. And so anyway, as you go in, the Marine checks your clearances, obviously. And there were about 11, 12 men and myself. And the lights start to go down, and he kind of tells people to stop, and he looks at me, and then looks away, and then looks at me and said, do you have a security clearance? So I looked at him and said, yes. And then he realized he'd goofed up because, you know, South Carolina is a chivalrous place. People are beginning to feel awkward for me, and I wish they hadn't because things happen. And so he said, oh, I thought you were somebody's wife. So I said, I am. So that kind of broke the ice and broke the thing. So those things happen. I mean, and it happened again and again. I used to think, okay, when I enter a room, they're thinking, she's wandered in from the cafeteria. Then after a while, something happens and I open my mouth, because obviously I'm there because I know something about the issue. And their first shock is, my God, she can speak English. So I always said, look, I get a hearing because they're so stunned I can speak English. Then they begin to focus on what I'm saying. But there were a lot of people who used to get very annoyed at it. And I said, you know, it's going to happen. I mean, you're going to either spend your whole time being frustrated and angry, or you're going to laugh it off as a glass half full. Only in America could I mean, I became a citizen in '71, and I never kept dual nationality. I was only an American citizen, and I am still. And in 1980, you know, I went to the Secretary of State's staff. Right. In '84, I went to the President's staff. In 1990, I became an American ambassador. So this is an American story. So I'm not going to be kind of going on and complaining about. It's not fun, though. Sometimes you feel, you know, like slapping a few people, but you obviously don't. In those days, you didn't.
One hopes not.
And, you know, I mean, people would say, oh, you know, they'd say, be complimentary, and this, you know, we've all had our Me Too moments. I'm very discreet, so I don't write about them, but we've all had them. It's just the nature of the beast.
And I know we could have a conversation simply on that subject, but we will not.
Because I won't talk.
We will not today because you won't talk, and that's fine. I have a couple more questions, and then I want to turn it over to the audience. But I want to move to the foreign policy issues that you had to deal with. And you were brought in at a time when the United States was trying to rekindle or to revivify its relationship with Pakistan because of Pakistan's strategic location in dealing with Afghanistan. And basically, you open up the newspaper today, if I went to the policy planning staff today, they would still be talking about if there is a policy planning staff. Right. We can get to that question too. But people would still be asked this question: is how should, you know, what role is Pakistan playing in Afghanistan? What role are US-Pakistani relations, right? How well do the United States and Pakistan understand each other? And I am curious, you know, when you look at it, like I read that quote from the book that made it sound like we didn't, you know, we only got along really when we felt like we could perceive things the same way, and we didn't perceive things the same way. Have things gotten better? Have they gotten worse? Have they stayed the same? To what do you attribute that?
Well, I'd like to make sort of an overall general comment to put this discussion under.
Sure.
And that is that, you know, we have very different systems of government, Pakistan and the US, and many other countries, not just Pakistan. For the United States, history is a cycle of 4 years. I've lived through those cycles. I've been at the White House when elections were held. So, you know, and possibly 8 years. In other countries, they remember what the US said and did in 1950. And Pakistan's not unique in this. So there is a disconnect in terms of memory in relationships, which I think jeopardizes smooth relations a lot more than it needs to. I mean, when a president leaves, his papers go to his presidential library, first to the National Archives, then to the library. People even now call me up if they're in a hurry for something that they think sounds familiar, but they don't have time to look it up. Say, did this happen? And you think, my God, I mean, this is the United States government. We're basing things on phone calls, on the odd chance you'll get somebody. So that makes life complicated for any relationship. Within that, yes, perceptions have been different. Institutions have been different. The role of institutions in Pakistan vis-a-vis the role of institutional leaders has made it a very much more hands-on approach, which has varied through from Zia to Bhutto to Nawaz Sharif to whoever. Here it's been much institutionalized, but certain presidents recognizing the role of the United States at a given juncture took advantage of that opening to connect. Like Reagan, seeing the Soviet invasion, which had already occurred, the US could not prevent it, did not even know about it, saw it as an opportunity to change history, the end of, you know, the Soviet empire. And in that search, two things happened vis-a-vis Pakistan. One, that Pakistan's location and its history and its willingness to be the front line of an American pushback to the Soviet Union was one of those things. And secondly, the Reagan desire to open up India to American influence at that time was a long shot, but at least receptivity, and to wean it away from Russia. I mean, every administration discovers India. But if you look at the genesis of where that occurred, it was actually in the Reagan administration. So those two things came together because of the US's, the particular president's particular interest. Other presidents have suffered through other events that were thrust on us, like the terrorist attack of 9/11, which once again made Pakistan's location both a possibility for cooperation and problematic, because by this time, Pakistan and the US had so disconnected. And there was such a sense of the US having not kept its promises in Pakistan, and 3 million refugees who still live in Pakistan, and areas of the country still under sort of the aftermath of the drug running, the arms running, from which was part of our legacy in that part of the world. Right. Our being US in this case. So it's been, but I think on the whole, what has stayed constant, in my view, and there may be people who don't believe that, but I've seen it. Both when I was in government and subsequently, including my most recent trip, there has always been a desire to get along with America. People recognize that the United States is important for the well-being of the international order, and also for peace and stability in South Asia. That absent the United States, it's a harder task. And I think that is what provides opening government after government. Right now, there's probably more opening there than there is here, because that's one of the tragedies. They don't always happen in tandem.
That is the difficulty, right? Different countries on different schedules. Right. Before I turn to the audience, so you get ready for your question, I'm going to ask you this, right? Of course, the United States and Pakistan do have one thing in common, right? In their most recent elections, they decided to elect someone who was famous for something other than being a politician to become their chief executive. The United States elected Donald Trump. The Pakistanis have elected Imran Khan. And the fact that we have politicians, we have leaders in countries who are themselves, they represent themselves as outsiders, that they're going to bring a fresh perspective. Where does that fit into the search for a new relationship? Is it, because especially when you talk about the idea of the lack of institutional memory can be a problem. But if people are elected to high office, who part of their appeal is they have no connection to institutional memory, right? So is it a chance to start completely fresh? Or is it harder to find your way when there is not the experience?
Well, I think both these leaders are somewhat unique.
Mm-hmm. I think we can. That is a statement upon which everyone can agree.
I'd like to sort of look at it in terms of these two unique people at this unique moment in history. Mm. I think the sense of alienation, which apparently led to the election of both of these leaders, mm-hmm. they share in common. Mm-hmm. A desire for change. Mm-hmm. And the expectation from their respective constituencies. In Pakistan, the younger generation, who saw previous leaders, each of whom have had 3 turns basically, right. as doing nothing much for the country, even if they have, but doing much more for themselves. Mm-hmm. In America, that same sense of being left behind, not being part of the, and I think a general, easier for me to say, I guess, in some ways, because I've been around different presidents. The narrative is much more exclusionary in Washington than used to be. And I think I am told, though I'm grateful that my own experience doesn't already reflect that this is a reaction in the United States to having had a very inclusive or, an African-American president, in mm-hmm. fact. Mm-hmm. So but the people who felt that was not their thing felt that they wanted some change. In Pakistan, the younger people look at Imran Khan as somebody, after all, he led the cricket team to the only World Cup that Pakistan has won. He's an international star mm-hmm. in many ways, and some people don't like him, but the fact is he doesn't have a record of corruption, mm-hmm. which has corroded a very good country. The thing that people like my father gave up everything to help build has been sort of used to further one's own agenda and enrich oneself, which is unforgivable. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I think if their mindsets as people who think outside the box ought to be able to cut through some of this current impasse. Mm-hmm. Because if one leader says he's the brightest person with the biggest brain that's ever occurred, and the other one says, I'm cat's meow, there ought to be some point at which they can begin to
They should be able to understand each other.
But I also understand that the most recent interaction between the two governments, which was on the margins of the UN General Assembly, where the foreign minister came and then met with senior people in Washington, not Trump. I think he shook his hand at the reception, but not as a meeting. They talked about finding the commonalities because there's a desire that America will not get peace in Afghanistan without Pakistan's help. And there's a need for Pakistan to have America be a friendly or at least a neutral country as it tries to put its house in order. So there's a commonality there that I understand that they found. Mm-hmm. How this plays out, I think, as the foreign minister said openly, the road to Washington for Pakistan is through Kabul.
Through Kabul. Mm-hmm.
I think they recognize that. Mm-hmm. And if Pakistan can be part, I think it's unfair to put everything in Pakistan's lap mm-hmm. because there are such big issues in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And I disagreed with some of those decisions the US made when I was in government. Sitting and talking to Khalilzad at the Situation Room, I said, you're going down this road. And now we're at that point we are. And so maybe we can fix some of those issues and they can be part of the solution. But I also think that this is something new I'm sort of started to think about, that America's desire to get away from it all, ambassadorships not filled, meetings not being held, whatever. Maybe it's a good thing for the region. Even though, India and America have good relationship, but it's on some issues, it's hug, hug, kiss, kiss. On other issues, going to slap on sanctions. So everybody's realizing that the region needs to take, and that includes India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, at least those three. Mm-hmm. And then you can talk about China, Russia, whoever else.
Indeed.
Need to sort of come to some level of agreement where this part of the world, which is actually full of promise, not just full of problems, gets interconnected and begins to deal with its own problems on its own. Start small. And my new mantra is promise nothing, deliver a lot. So, maybe this is a good thing. It'll take a decade plus to play out because, America not being involved is not always a bad thing. As long as we're not threatening, fire and brimstone every other day.
That would be good. All right. So I have more questions, but I know you have more questions. So are there any questions from the audience for the ambassador? Yes, right over here, David. Let me bring, Tatiana is going to bring you the microphone.
Hello, Madam Ambassador. I was thinking while you were speaking that it's been at least 2 decades since we last spoke to each other. The event I'm thinking of was you were there with your husband at an FPRI event. Nice seeing you again. I'm puzzled by the title of your book, Before the Age of Prejudice. I assume you're talking about the United States, although perhaps not. But what exactly does this, I assume that what it means is that we're in an age of prejudice now, but at some point in the past we were not in an age of prejudice. What is it that specifically that you're referring to?
Good question. You can give it to the gentleman right next to you, David. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
Oh, the short answer would be, of course, you need to read the book, then you'll know. But Before the Age of Prejudice goes with being a Muslim in America today. Very different from my experience. So I would like to think that I was just part of a continuum with these opportunities that came my way. Are things that would go on. I don't see that. I think there's a pulling back from that, and being a Muslim was never held against me in the days that I worked in government. So that's what it refers to. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. What on earth is the United States doing in Afghanistan?
Now, and I'll build on that question because it's a very good question, right? You essentially, as someone who was present at the creation there in the 80s when the Reagan doctrine was developed and the idea that Afghanistan is this terrible quagmire, we're going to make the Soviets pay, and then you by a quirk of history or a massive historical irony, right? You were present also when the United States decided, after driving the Soviets out of the graveyard of empires, decided to begin digging very deeply its own grave in the same graveyard. How do we understand American policy towards Afghanistan?
My question is, what on earth are we doing in Afghanistan?
Now.
Yeah, that's right. That's good. Then, now, and ever. Yeah, that's fine. Go right ahead.
Well, we have said from time to time what we're doing in Afghanistan, and we have couched no, I mean, it's been a place that has just sucked up a lot of American treasure, and I don't mean in terms of money, in terms of American sacrifice and blood. And it was initially the idea was that here was an opportunity to change the East-West equation through bringing the Soviet Union to its knees, which it did. I mean, that was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union as such. We poured ourselves in terms of both material goods and in terms of our commitment and our diplomacy to making that happen. The problem looking back, and I think there was a lot of discussion even at the time. It isn't just looking back, hindsight is 20/20 or whatever the famous saying goes, that the pulling away from a non-Soviet occupied Afghanistan and just abandoning it and the whole region by declaring victory is what has come back to bite us. And now people, even when now administrations, Republican, Democrat, talk about what the heck are we doing there, there's always in the discussion an unease about going back to the zero presence. Because Afghanistan is even more turbulent now than it was when Dawood was prime minister and overthrown, and even when the communist government was overthrown. There's more divisiveness. Afghanistan is a tribal society, as you know. It has always been a tribal society. It will always be a tribal society. The American desire after 9/11, because of the Taliban having given refuge to bin Laden, to then punish Taliban and the Pashtuns who make up, they're a majority population in Afghanistan, to kind of exclude them totally for the Northern Alliance, created the mistakes that we are now living with. Because the Northern Alliance cannot hold all of Afghanistan. So and then weak governments buttressed by American military presence. And it's with an unending kind of a fight. So it's a wonderfully, critically important question. What on earth are we doing? What are we doing depends on the year you talk about, the time you talk about, the administration you talk about, both here and there. We don't have a single narrative that connects what we are doing. Therefore, I worry about where this goes.
Let's go over here, please. The microphone will come to you. Yes, sir.
What would happen if the United States just pulled out of Afghanistan in the next year or two?
Sorry, I missed that.
What if the United States just pulled out of Afghanistan?
Absent any kind of rules of the game, political engagement, you mean? Just kind of got up tomorrow and said, we're out of here, like we did in
Like in Vietnam in 75, declare victory and get out.
Okay, and then Vietnam changed.
Yes.
And then we waited a long time, and now the economics of Vietnam have brought up kind of a dialogue with America. Right. So I'm sure that it's very tempting for many people to do just that. But the problem in Afghanistan is you've got American friends who don't want that to happen. India doesn't want that to happen because they're worried that Pakistan may get a big hold in it. Or that China might show up with something. Or Iran would, so there are these other conflicting things which were not comparable to what happened in Vietnam. Well, I don't know. The threat, Al-Qaeda is only one of many threats now. And the world itself has sort of got all kinds of subsets of subsets. You've got the ISIS, you've got within ISIS certain kinds of, so what they stand for, some of those people might. If you had a total vacuum, we don't know. If you could have an Afghan government that had the capacity and the will to have a government of unity, or whatever they call it, to take charge and go back to maybe the 34 Constitution, where it was always tribal, it was always provincial. Kabul only ruled over Kabul, foreign affairs and defense. Maybe it has to be less centralized. Something like that which the Afghans themselves have to find, and the country's contingent, including Iran, India, Pakistan, China, have to some way guarantee that they will play by some rules of the game. I think it'd be hard to just leave it as a, everybody take a walk kind of a thing, because everybody won't. And then will it come back to hurt the US? And will it cost even more next time?
That's, of course, the question, right? So you start a problem, try to finish a problem. But the issue of how long it's going to last after 17 years, who knows? Let's go one more question here up front.
Thank you for a delightful talk. You've had a unique opportunity to observe the halls of government from the vantage point of a Muslim woman who's now been an American. And the United States has interfaced more and more in more and more bellicose ways with the Islamic world over your tenure. I would imagine that when you started, there was a lot of lack of insight into what these other countries of the Southeastern Asia, of the Arab countries were about, and that you were sort of a voice in the wilderness. I'm curious as to your perception of how things have evolved or not evolved over time, whether there are a lot more Muslim Americans in government and whether there's a lot more insight. And kind of what triggered the question was when you were talking about Paul Wolfowitz and the neocons and the fundamental mistakes we made in Iraq over the Shia-Sunni schism that we were apparently oblivious to when we made a lot of those decisions. And I just wonder, what has America learned over the last 30 years from your vantage point as a Muslim American?
So what have we learned, Shirin?
Well, we've looked at the Muslim world post-45 through a certain prism of East-West relationships. We made friendships with, monarchies, because that's what we knew and we were comfortable with. And we learned about religion, because even in a sophisticated diplomatic corps with its cadre of very, very smart Arabists and so on, but they were all, sort of focused on Islam through diplomacy and stuff. We didn't, and I don't think we still understand sort of the street power of Islam, the ordinary Muslim. Even in the current administration with the first ever trip to Saudi Arabia that President Trump went on and so on, what he engaged with was a very orchestrated kind of, opulent, that sitting in that, Trump Tower times 100 palace over there, and dealing with all of the monarchies and stuff. The conversations that we've had over time through, the freedom agenda or something else, with the Democrats amongst the Muslim populations, amongst the scholars of Islam, etc., have been missing again. We've kind of, and we compensate for it, I think, and I speak this now as a total outsider, so I'm not privy to it, and maybe if somebody's doing all of this, though I certainly haven't heard of it. But we're sort of doing it from the 60,000 feet vantage point, because to get down there is messy. And, the sort of higher altitudes give us a perspective we're comfortable with. So we don't really know that much more about how to deal with it in the practical sense of a world that's still very much in turmoil. And in Iraq, I think that itself is a whole long thing, but the invasion was not accompanied by a cadre of people who were knowledgeable on Iraq, of which there were many in America. And that was a shortcoming. We expected things that people would have told us would not happen. And we didn't expect things that did happen. And as I write in my book, I was not for the war in Iraq, but I went in after 9/11, felt it was my duty to help wherever I could. And I went into the White House just 4 days after the war. So I saw a lot of, and I had the portfolio for democracy, human rights, and international operations, which meant all of the, bridge building, multilateral diplomacy. And got involved because America is a generous country. It wants to do the best it can in so many ways. We don't succeed, but it's not often for lack of trying. I got involved with the building of this first ever pediatric children's hospital in Basra in Iraq in the middle of the war. So I was flying in and out of the war zones and Black Hawks and C-130s and landing here and there and helping. And the hospital actually opened in 2010. And it was, so those of us who were part of that team got to see a lot more civil society because those were the people we worked with to build the hospital. And there was a huge kind of gap between that and then what was coming from Washington in kind of waves of edicts. And it was painful, some of it. Not all of it was inevitable.
I'm afraid that is both a hopeful and a sobering thought, right? Things can be done, but many things have been left undone. I'm afraid that's where we have to leave this discussion tonight. We've used up our hour. Thank you very much, Ms. Ambassador, for joining us. Thank you. So, FPRI would especially like to thank the National Liberty Museum for hosting us and the Stanley and Arlene Ginsberg Family Foundation for their generous support for this program. Today's conversation is just the beginning, of course, here at FPRI. The world goes on, and every month we will be here to discuss it at Geopolitics with Granary. If you have enjoyed our discussion today, please tell a friend and bring a friend next time when we will gather to analyze our complex world. To keep up with future episodes of Geopolitics with Granary and other events at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channels. You can follow the host of this program at Ronald Granary. But until next time, for all of us here at FPRI, especially the capable staff of PWP Video, and my FPRI colleagues who helped produce this program, Rachel Hemler and Tatiana Cunningham, I'm Ron Granary. Thanks very much for joining us. Good night.